Good morning. The Hearing Board of the South Coast Air Quality Management District is in session. The day is Wednesday, February 19th, 2020. Time is just after 9 o'clock a.m., and we are meeting in the Hearing Board room in Diamond Bar. We have a very empty room today and only one matter, which is on consent calendar today by agreement of the parties, and that is Tesoro Refining and Marketing Company, LLC, case number 4982-122 for a short variance and an AOC. We have received consent calendar documents, and I know that all board members have had an opportunity to review them. Let's start with the stipulation, which was filed on February 13th. Ooh, excuse me. In the joint stipulation of the parties, they agree to have the matter placed on the consent calendar. The parties also agree that the declaration of Young S. Chung, which was filed with the stipulation, shall be admitted into evidence. And so at this time, I'm going to mark the declaration of Young S. Chung in support of order granting short variance and AOC as exhibit number 1. The parties have also agreed on the proposed findings and decision in order granting a short variance and AOC, which was also filed along with the stipulation. And so at this time, I'm going to mark the proposed findings and decision in order granting a short variance and AOC as exhibit number 2. The parties also request that the petition shall be amended to request 45 days rather than 44 days of variance and AOC coverage. And so we shall hereby amend the request in the petition to read 45 days rather than 44 days. The district notes it does not oppose the granting of the short variance and AOC. And the parties agree that the proposed order is not expected to result in a violation of Health and Safety Code 41700, which deals with nuisance. At this time, before we start deliberation, I'm just going to ask if there's any member of the public who wishes to be heard. And I see no one in the room still. And board members, we will begin deliberation. Anyone wish to begin the deliberation? I can begin, and I can say that this, for me, is a pretty straightforward matter. Whenever we deal with a matter that has to do with a refinery, we think it should be complex. However, in this matter, both the short variance and the AOC deal with the same matter, which is simply a SEMS, which is measuring NOx and SOx, needs maintenance, required maintenance, which has been explained in the papers, will take longer than normal for the maintenance that is required by the manufacturer. But at the same time, the kiln and the poly scrubber from the calciner which are major sources and which are measured by the SEMS, will also be shut down for a turnaround. So what petitioner is requesting is that while those major sources are shut down and there are no NOx or SOx emissions to be read, that the SEMS also be able to be taken offline. And if we go through each of the findings, obviously there are a number of rules and permit conditions which do require the SEMS to be recording NOx and SOx emissions from those sources at all times, and when it is taken out of service for up to 45 days, it will not be doing what it is required to be doing. I do believe it's beyond their reasonable control. It is the manufacturer's recommendation. We want to make sure that a SEMS is in good working order. And I think it makes the most sense to take it offline when there already are no excess emissions or any emissions from the sources for which it is reading continuous emissions, and monitoring those will not itself be operating, and there will be no excess emissions. That said, I think we can make the other findings, and that is, petitioner did look into renting a portable SEMS. It is costly, but in addition, it requires a power supply, and part of the issue here is that when the calciner is taken offline, there will be power interruptions, and so they would need to essentially operate a diesel or gasoline generator in order to power a portable SEMS, which would ironically create emissions where there would be none to be read by the SEMS, and so it would be additional emissions that are unnecessary, plus it is costly. The only other alternative is simply to not do the required maintenance on the SEMS, which again would leave petitioner and the surrounding community in this situation where they don't have a reliable SEMS, and petitioner would ultimately, if the SEMS is not in working order, would have to shut down the calciner and the major sources that are associated with it, which would be a harm. And I think that closing or taking would be without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants, because there are no excess emissions, because again, the calciner will be shut down. Bless you. Curtailment is not going to obviate the need for a short variance, or an AOC in this case, because petitioner already is shutting down the sources that are read by the continuous emissions monitoring system, and so and yet we still require a variance. So curtailment's not an option here; it already is occurring. Finally, there are no excess emissions, and so during the period that AOC and variance are in effect, the excess emissions will be reduced to the maximum extent feasible. There are no excess emissions to reduce, but in addition, by not bringing in a portable SEMS, they are actually reducing the excess emissions to the maximum extent feasible. And finally, the monitoring is not required because there are no excess emissions, but verification that those sources are shut down is something that we would want to see and would want to require, and the district and the petitioner have already agreed to that in the proposed conditions, which is to install a blind and to make sure that there can be no fuel flow to the equipment, and also that there will be records taken of fuel usage to verify that, in fact, no fuel has been used during the variance period. So I'm going to stop there because those are the 6 findings for the short variance. And if this were a hearing where we had the parties, we would probably do this. We would bifurcate our motion, and first we would deliberate on the short variance. We're not going to bifurcate our motion because we have one proposed findings and decision, but let's bifurcate the discussion. So if anyone else wishes to be heard on the 6 findings, Ms. Verdugo-Peralta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with what you stated in regards to the 6 findings. Since it's the manufacturer's recommendation, I think that's very important when you're looking at the type of equipment and the type of facility that this is. The maintenance has to be done on a regular basis. And if they're going to shut down the monitored equipment that is creating the criteria pollutants of NOx and SOx, this is the perfect timing for them to be able to shut down the SEMS as well that does monitor these 2 criteria pollutants. Even though they're going to have to go beyond the time that they normally utilize, I think it's very important that they are allowed to do so without penalty. The fact that you also mentioned it is very costly for them to rent the alternative equipment to replace it, and especially with the fact that they'd have to be utilizing another generator that has diesel fuel that would be creating additional excess emissions. I think it's very important that they don't do that. So for those reasons, I agree that this meets the findings, meets the 6 findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts on the findings? Mr. Balagopalan? Oh, Senator?
I think it's already been stated that the petition is currently not in violation at this particular
No, that's a
time.
very good point. Thank you.
They're not currently in violation. And so everything else would follow that's been already expressed so well. If they're denied, of course, according to number 17, page 6, they have to go out and rent the equipment, and if the operator is still going to generate additional emissions, so they're better off just making the repairs. It may take some time because it's still uncertain, even though they want to have it done sometime in April. When the parts go to Texas to be upgraded, they bring it back here. They have to go back and do some additional tests to make sure it's compatible with the system. It may or may not be due to unforeseen circumstances. That being the case, they'll be coming back to us, which is okay.
Thank you for that. Dr. Bernstein?
Ditto. What everybody said basically covered all the main points. This is a pretty straightforward and easy case to determine. I don't really have any questions regarding it. They need a short variance, have done whatever they need to do to meet the findings, and as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty clear cut. Thank you.
Mr. Balagopalan?
Yeah, I wanted to go last because I'm taking the contrary position. I think that this is the third case that I've said, and where it is similar, where there's a turnaround and the SEMS has to be taken down or cannot or be operated. I think the one prior to this, the SEMS was in the stack, but they had to take down the stack to do the work on the furnace and so forth. And I read the rule, I've gone through it. The only problem I think as before is the first finding. The rule says you have to continuously monitor NOx and SOx emission. However, when the unit is not operating, there's no NOx and SOx. It also says other variables, which is the flow and flow rate and other variables, but none of those variables will be available because the unit is shut down. And I think they clearly, if you look at exhibit number 2, page 5, line 27, I think the petitioner actually very clearly stated it's impossible to continuously operate the SEMS or any SEMS at the calciner during the turnaround and resulting shutdown, regardless of whether the SEM is removed for necessary maintenance. So basically, in a way, what the rule is saying, you have to have a SEM to read what's in the background because there's no NOx or SOx emission. The only purpose of the SEM is to read background. I think the intent, probably my guess is, assurance that the unit is not operating, but there are conditions, there are methods that can verify that. So like putting the blind, I think you mentioned, and then the petitioner has mentioned putting the blind in the head and the natural gas is clear. And that's, I think, procedures they follow during normal tag out, tag in operation for safety, and they have to make sure it's all tagged out. So they will put the blind regardless, and so that ensures there's no flow. Same thing with the power. They'll have to shut down, tag it out. And so bringing a SEMS in, you won't have the power. But if you want to argue, then you say, if the rule really says you need a SEM regardless of no emissions and you need to monitor, then you can bring a SEM in, you can bring a portable SEM in, hook it somewhere else in the plant where it's electrical outlet and not generator. But we all know it's pointless, that you're measuring nothing basically from the process, so why, So that's, the reason why. And I think the good news, if I can bring that up, is, and I brought this up before too, in the non-reclaim rule in 1110.2, F1A, paragraph 6, Romanet 8, there is clear language, stop operating, calibrating the SEMS during any period that the operator has continuous record, then the engine.
Wait, slow that down?
Huh?
I'm listening. Slow that down?
What's that? Oh, slow that down. Oh, stop operating and calibrating the SEMS during any period that the operator has a continuous record that the engine was not in operation. And the reason I bring this up is the rules are going to be, because reclaim is sunsetting, and they are looking at the landing rules, and so it's 218 and 218.1 is, initially they were going to amend the rule, but the last presentation that I saw, they're going to develop two new rules, 2 and 3, I believe, you know, to address, and move all the reclaim requirement over to the it'll be all become non-reclaim. And so some languages, I think there's already been discussion about having, you know, the language so that when the unit is, when the source is not operating, and then they can, you know, the SAMs don't have to be operated. So there's discussion and thoughts going in there. And I think what I would like to bring out is the fact, I think we've seen this turnaround at refineries or power plants, and turnaround sometimes, you know, they go through a process, as we all know. You know, when they have a turnaround, they have to, the SEMS will be operating, they shut down the furnace, in this case probably, and the scrubber, the control system, and then shut down the SEMS, and they do the opposite. They start the SEMS and then start the control and then start the furnace. So there's a procedures in there, but sometimes, you know, they can't wait 7 days to stop the SEMS. You know, the turnaround, they may have to do it in the very day or second day. So hopefully, you know, the rule writers are looking at turnarounds and will address, you know, I think we've seen quite a number of turnarounds coming here at the board and address that, because now they'll all be non-reclaim. You know, once it moves over and sunsets and the landing, the other rules take precedence over the operation of the SEMS. So in that, and so I'm heartened to see that discussion is ongoing with the folks who are affected, and also with the district staff is also proposing that. But for that reason, I know I'm the moderator, I don't see a violation on the fact that they cannot, because the rules say specifically continuously monitor NOx and SOx. So the way I say it is, there's no NOx and SOx or variables to monitor at that time when it's shut down. So, you know.
So your position is the rule specifically does not address that if there's no NOx and SOx, but how would you know? That assumes a knowledge that there's no emissions coming out of it. Well, emissions are always going to vary. So if the requirement doesn't mean that SEMS is always working absent a variance, well, then there's always a question of how much is coming out. Is there anything coming out? I don't know if there's anything coming out. And wouldn't that require SEMS to always be operating?
Well, let's take this specific case. You know, you have the furnace shut down, the control shut down, and we already said the SEMS cannot be operated. If you have to operate, to bring in a rental SEMS, you're going to...
Wait, but you're mixing and matching. You're saying
No,
bring in a rental SEMS, but before we get to whether they bring in a rental or portable SEMS, you have to decide whether there's actually a violation. And if the rules are very clear, it says you have to continuously, which means without exception,
Right.
monitor the amount that's coming out. It doesn't say unless it's shut down.
Well, and that the rationale I'm making is once you're shut down, there's no NOx and SOx. The rule says you have to monitor NOx and SOx and other variables.
But you don't know that there's not NOx and SOx unless the monitor is working.
No, when you cut off the fuel line,
But it doesn't say that.
you know.
Is there an exception if there's a cutoff fuel line?
No, I think that's, you know.
So I would I understand your position.
Yeah, that's
But I would disagree, and I think the main point is that the district disagrees. And so, and I'm not saying we always have to take what the district says, but if we never want to put facilities into that catch-22 where if they operate, but they're reading the rules to say they don't need a SEM, so they don't need a variance, but then the district disagrees, well, then the district's going to go out and issue NOVs, and they're going to have to answer to that. So if the district is saying, this is not the way we read it, we read it, continuous means continuous, there is no exception for if you're blindly cutting it off, or you're doing a blind, whatever it's called.
And if that's the case, then the position also, then they bring in a portable SEMS and measure it. And essentially measure nothing, but just bring it in to measure nothing, you know.
Okay, so that's a different point. Okay, so moving off of whether it's a violation, you don't believe that they are, well, you believe that there's what?
Well, no, the requirement is, I think the way it's,
That they won't be in
Whether it's
violation if they bring in a
Whether they
portable
are
SIMS.
operating or not operating, the SEMS has to be continuously operated. That's the, even if there's no emissions, the position is there has to be a SEM that is in full operation and monitoring. So we know, of course, and let's say that the SEMS was still standing and they didn't have to send it out, except maybe in 96 hours they can do the repair, and it's not a major repair like in this case. So then the SEMS is still in operation. They can continue to operate and measure, even though they're measuring nothing, they can still measure and submit whatever data is submitted. But however, we know in this case, they want to bring it down too. So everything will be down. So the only alternative to comply with the rule, if you want to say continuously monitor it, is to bring another unit in. And that has been done in one case, I believe, and do the monitoring. But why do that when you're really not doing anything? So I'll just leave it at that.
Right, so it's just you continue to disagree whether there is an actual violation?
Yes,
Okay,
that's
and
it,
then
yeah.
that's fair enough. Senator?
On page 3,
Of
item 9
Of the proposed order, or,
of the petition.
oh, the petition?
Item 9 explains it in detail. It says, list all district rules and/or permit conditions for which you are seeking a variance relief. And therefore, they have to have a SIM according to the rules. There's no deviation. There's no deviation according to this specs.
And actually, it says continuously monitor NOx and SOx emission and other variables, So if there are no NOx emission or SOx emission or other
I
variables.
mean, do you disagree with the rules?
No, I'm not disagreeing with the rule. I'm just literally, and maybe I'm literally parsing that and saying, it says you have to continuously monitor if there are NOx and SOx emission. In this case, there's really no NOx, SOx emission, or any other variables like flow. That's
If it's shut down, there's none.
yeah, exactly, and that's what is happening here. It's a turnaround.
So-
It's shut down.
No, it's shut down, so there's no question.
Yeah, it is a turnaround, so it is shut down.
It's shut down.
Yeah, it is a shutdown.
So there's nothing to monitor.
There's nothing to monitor. Exactly. That's
That's what they're saying right here in the petition.
And that's also what they say, that, there's nothing to monitor, even if we bring a SEM in, to this, and and then it may be right where they want to locate it, because they probably tagged out all the electrical, because of, you don't want any circuit breaker accidentally being turned on. So I'm sure, all kinds of electrical outages are there, so you cannot hook the SEMs, the portable SEM that they
If
bring
they
in.
shut down, what could happen?
Nothing.
There you go.
Yeah, no, that's.
Right, but we,
think
but I think I'll give it one more shot of reading it. I think I feel you're allowing a flexibility to be built into the words of the rule. The rule is black and white, and the way the law works is it's black and white, it's read as the words say. If it says it has to continuously monitor, that means continuously monitor. It doesn't mean with breaks or anything like that. If there are no exceptions built into the rule, if the district had intended to have an exception for shutdown, then there would have been such an exception, except with the following exceptions, when the monitored equipment is shut down. Otherwise, think about this. A facility could, again, I don't see that this is practical, but just imagine that there is such a piece of equipment which could be turned on and off at will. And the facility says, well, we turned it on Thursday, we turned it off on Friday, we turned it back on Saturday, we turned it back off on Sunday, and so we didn't run the SEMS during Friday and Sunday. But we're not required to, because it wasn't continuously belting out any NOx or SOx, and we didn't have to continuously monitor it because there was nothing there. Well, the point of the SEMS is to validate the fact that nothing's coming out, or that they're below the limit, or that they're below emissions. So if you're allowing them a reading of a rule which allows them to turn the SEMS off, on and off, as they turn on and off the equipment, that allows for for fabrication of results. It allows for something that I don't think was intended by the rule. So I think the rule wants facilities to have it continuously monitored. If that's not a possibility, they have to come to the hearing board for a variance, and then such things as conditions which put the blind on it would be put in place.
No, you're actually mischaracterizing what I said, but
Oh,
there is
okay.
regard-
Oh,
you know, but
if I
that's
am,
okay.
tell me how.
No, and I think the conditions are good, and I think those are conditions that, the inspectors can easily verify with the blind in there and fuel usage, so that will ensure that during that period, that the unit was not in operation, So I wasn't saying they can periodically shut down, start up, and have the
I'm
same.
not saying that that's what you're saying the rule is
yeah,
intended to
that's-
do, but I'm saying with a reading of if it's
The
not
example you
continuous.
gave was not what, yeah.
But you have to imagine that. If it is the logical extension of the reading you're giving it. If it's not continuous, they're not required to use it.
No, again, if, again, it's continuous, yes, if it's continuous and also emitting NOx and SOx. So and other variables too. So it's not, let's say, whatever reason, there's no NOx and SOx, but there's other flow and so forth, then because the rule also says not only NOx and SOx, but other variables like flow rate and so forth, the SEM has to record that. But in the case of the shutdown, everything is down, there's no other variables either, so.
Absolutely. When you look at page 6 of the petition, paragraph 17, it tells you what they have to do.
Right,
Right.
yeah.
What a denial of the variance would result in significant economic loss, number one. Importantly, with the rules specified in paragraph 9, they got to comply with that.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to go last. I knew that my position's contrary.
No,
to-
of course.
and,
No,
and
no,
so-
And I'm
they're saying what they shall do.
Yes, and I think that's why I said the good news is with the, maybe not good news for facilities, reclaim and sunsetting, but with the, with the,
debatable.
the sunset reclaim and everything, and it's going to, the proposed rules are looking at not requiring such, as maybe it's very explicitly
Yes, your
be
question.
stated in turnarounds and when it's shut down, and there can be verifiable shutdowns that you don't need to operate the SEMS. So I think that's the good of moving forward, that will be, a lot clearer.
How does paragraph 17 differ from what you're saying? Or is it same as what you're saying?
I think the question is,
I want to ask,
okay.
17 on the,
on petition, page 6.
Well, while he's looking, I just want to say, I believe that the debate is that the requirement of the rules is continuous monitoring. And what Mr. Balagopalan is saying is that if there are no continuous emissions to monitor, that perhaps there's no violation if the SEMS is taken
There's
out.
no violation. They say they're not.
Of course there's a violation, otherwise we would not need to give a variance. So if you're saying there's no violation, then you're with Mr.
They say they need a
Balagopalan.
variance because, they specify why they say they need a variance.
Right, because they're not operating the
Paragraph
SEMS.
17.
Because they're not operating the SEMS.
actually, Senator, which, are we looking at the proposed finding or the petition? I'm sorry.
On the petition.
In the
page-
petition, okay, sorry.
Page 6, paragraph 17.
I got page 6.
So clear.
Oh, yeah. So I think we're not saying anything, I look at 17, so
And I
Is
don't
that the
have it
one?
in front of me.
I'm not sure if I'm looking at the right.
Oops. You're saying page
6.
6, number 17. This is harm to business.
Yeah, harm to business, so.
Denial of the variance would result in significant economic losses? Is that what you're
And they, no,
requiring?
and they're right.
They got to comply with the
Denial would result in harm to petitioner. To comply with rules specified in paragraph 9 above, petitioner would be required to obtain portable SEMS equipment.
In
backup
paragraph
generator.
9, that's what you're talking about.
Paragraph, so what you're really referring to is paragraph 9, right? So that's where the rules are.
They refer to paragraph 9.
So they're saying that the rules require that a facility permit permit holder comply at all times with permit conditions. Conditions require SEMS to be installed, maintained, and operated to continuously monitor and report NOx and SOx, and require determination, blah, 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 of mass emissions. And then also of different subparagraphs of different rules as well, They also require a direct monitoring device to continuously monitor the concentration of SOx and NOx. And I believe, and I don't want to paraphrase, but tell me if I'm wrong, the debate between Mr. Balagopalan and myself is that Mr. Balagopalan believes, as his reading of the rules, that continuously monitoring NOx and SOx doesn't apply if it's off,
And
and
actually,
there are no NOx and SOx to.
and I think if you read where you're reading the very last part, however, and the facility will be shut down, I think that's what the sentence, and there'll be no emission for the SIMS to monitor and report, you know. and-
So,
and
so, so Mr. Balagopalan is saying, if there's no emissions, then it doesn't need to continuously monitor emissions, because there are no emissions. But I'm saying, I think that's circular logic, because it requires continuous monitoring. If they can't do that for some reason, then they need to, if it's more than the 4 days that are allowed by rule, they have to come to the hearing board, explain why they can't, which they have done, and we have to give them a variance from the rule, which has conditions that require to be sure that if they're not operating their SIMs, that we know they're not operating their equipment. Otherwise, they could just come in and say, we're not operating it.
And one way.
Ha, we are.
And
I
one
mean-
way, and one way, because the SIM has to be taken off for service, is to bring a portable SIM and measure, you know, basically ambient air.
So then you move to that, and you're saying they're not bringing it up, you're saying they should do that, because they can comply and they don't require a variance.
But at the same, but but on the flip side, it, you know, which is, again, will counter my argument, it's pointless to bring something to measure nothing. And in the case they don't have the electricity, you know, it create more emissions. So I'm not going to,
But sometimes things are counterintuitive.
Yeah, I know.
Regardless, so you still have to be able to
yeah.
make the finding of
Right, yeah.
violation. Ms. Verdugo.
That was my biggest point there, that if they did bring in the equipment to create electricity for this, create power for this rental equipment, you're doing exactly what we don't want to do, and that's to create more emissions. And to me, that is the biggest point of allowing them to go ahead and get this variance, that we don't want them to create more emissions. And that's what they're trying to do.
Thank you. And I think we can all make all of the findings. Mr. Balagopalan differs on his interpretation of whether there is a violation. I know that I can make a finding of violation, and let's just, usually we bifurcate, but let's just have a poll so we can move on to the AOC, which is how many board members agree that there is, the 6 findings can be made, which would include violation. Mr. Balagopalan would say no. Ms. Verdugo Peralta, can you make the 6 findings? Okay. I can,
You know,
Senator?
please go to page 4.
oh, wait, let me just ask, Dr. Bernstein can. Page 4.
page 4.
Go to page 4 in the petition, paragraph 14, and it reads there that to allow the testing and proper retesting of the SIM, this variance petition requests variance relief to coincide with the period of the facility shutdown. The board has granted petitioner and petition predecessor short variances for similar SIMS maintenance work in case number, and they specify the cases. They've done this before.
We have done this before. But that is correct, but we are always a different board, and Mr.
done it before.
Balagopalan has a different,
And that's what the district wants.
okay.
Petitioner agrees.
But
It's a stipulated agreement.
let's move on, and what I think we have found is that, and again, the most direct source, as Mr. Balagopalan correctly looks at, is the rule itself, and it's our reading of the rule. 4 members are able to make the finding of violation. Mr. Balagopalan respectfully cannot. And so we have a majority to move on because I believe we can all make all the other findings. And so I just want to talk about the few remaining AOC findings that we need to make for the alternative operating condition. And that would be starting on, page 9, which is that the AOC I'm sorry, page 9 of the findings and decision, which is Exhibit 2, that the AOC will not result in noncompliance with any NSPS, NESHAP, or other standard by the EPA, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's no excess emissions. No, the calciner will not be operating. And there are no NSPS, NESHAP, or other Clean Air Act standards that apply to the SEMS or calciner during the shutdown, et cetera. Also, the other findings we need to make, most of them result or have to do with nuisance or violation of a NAAQS or excess emissions. So there are no excess emissions that would be in excess of that, which is in the AOC credit bank. Also, there would be no injury, nuisance, et cetera, and the district actually agreed to that finding in the stipulation, as I had read. And of course, since there are no excess emissions, there would be no exceedance of any national ambient air quality standard. And so with that, all the additional findings that we need to make for an AOC can be made, in my estimation. Any other thoughts on the AOC?
I agree with that. The AOC can find it can be made. You know, there's no NSPS or NESHAP whatsoever. I think that there's specific SEMS regulation in 1675 that applies, but I don't think they're going to be in violation of that.
And thank you for that. Just so you know, in order for you to vote in favor, we can do this all together, because in order for you to vote in favor of the AOC, the 6 findings for a variance need to be made, because that gets incorporated into 518.2. Any other thoughts on the AOC? Okay. Then I'm going to make a motion, and it is in the matter of Tesoro Refining and Marketing Company, LLC, case number 4982-122. I move that we grant the requested short variance in AOC and the proposed findings and decision in order granting such short variance in AOC found in Exhibit 2, deleting only the words proposed from the caption and the footer. It will be, as is discussed on page 11 of the of Exhibit 2, it will be for a period that begins in the with the notice that will be given in accordance with paragraph 2A on page 11 of the order itself, which is essentially when the calciner is shut down, and the removal of the SEMS that serves the kiln and the poly scrubber. And it will go for 45 days, as is described in condition 3, or until the SEMS analyzers are reconnected to the kiln and poly scrubber, and the SEMS is restored to full operational status, whichever occurs first. And again, I'm reading directly from condition 3 of the proposed order, which we are incorporating herein. It is for the equipment and rules that are listed and discussed in the proposed order, findings and decision, and at the address that is also listed in on page, this has no page number. I suppose it's page 2, which is under nature of business and location of facility. And there are no excess emissions associated with this short variance or AOC. Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Okay, Ms. Verdugo-Peralta seconds the motion. Is there any, bless you, is there any discussion on the motion? Okay, seeing none, Senator, how do you vote? Aye. Dr. Bernstein, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mr. Balagopalan, how do you vote?
No.
Ms. Verdugo-Peralta, you vote?
Aye.
I vote yes. Motion passes 4-1. Is there any other business, board members? If not, we are adjourned. Thank you. Thank you for a good discussion.